None of us like tests, I don't think. Whether it's you students in school or as adults, the tests that life bring to us, they're not enjoyable. Tests try us. They point out to us things that we don't know. They show us areas where we don't know what we need to know and where we need to do some more learning. And that can be frustrating. A student was taking his final examinations just before the Christmas break, and on one test he didn't know the answer to a certain question, and so in frustration he just wrote down on the test paper, "God only knows the answer to this question. Merry Christmas." And the professor returned the paper with the following notation, "God gets an A, you get an F. Happy New Year." The fact of tests and testing is not just a part of the academic world of school and college, university, and all that kind of stuff. Testing is part of life as we live it out. And for the Christian, testing is a part of our walk of faith. Testing will be part of the growing process that we must go through as Christians. In our journey through the book of Genesis, we come today to this portion that Corey just read in the story of Abraham. And we see a test that Abraham had to go through. In fact, it says right there in the beginning of chapter 22 that this was a test. God was testing Abraham. And this is something that sooner or later all of us as Christians will have to face. God either sends or allows a test that will be a test of our faith. During this study, we've been watching Abraham grow in his faith. He's had some ups and he's had some downs, but through it all we see a growth. We see him growing in his understanding of who God is, growing in his walk of faith. The study of Abraham is a study of learning to walk by faith. So 2 weeks ago we looked at the last half of chapter 21. We saw Abraham and Abimelech. He was the king of that city-state of Gerar, where Abraham was kind of living. We saw those two work through a bit of a rift that had occurred in their relationship. And we saw some good lessons there about healing relationships. And so that brings us to our passage for this morning, chapter 22, which was read. Great test that God sent Abraham. And there are some great lessons here for us. So let's go through the story once again and then look at some application to our lives. Verse 1 tells us that after these things, after the events of the former chapter, God once again spoke to Abraham. And like I said, the purpose of this whole thing was a test. It was a test to Abraham. To accomplish this test, God had a strange request. He asked Abraham to take his son. As you read through there, it's very clear as to just what this son meant to Abraham. Isaac was very dear to Abraham's heart. Take your son, your only son, the one that you love, and go to the land of Moriah. And there he was to offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which God would show him. Well, what do you make of that? Maybe the better question was, what do you think Abraham thought of that? You and I can't answer that correctly because we know the story. But Abraham at this point didn't know the story. God was asking him to make a human sacrifice of his only son Isaac, whom he dearly loved. Now, human sacrifices in the pagan peoples around Abraham at that time, it wasn't common, but it was not unheard of. Some pagan religions did practice child sacrifice, especially the land of which Abraham originally came from, the Chaldeans. They practiced child sacrifice. So likely this request didn't shock Abraham's conscience like it does ours. But the thing was, Isaac was the child of God's promise. Isaac was the miracle baby that they conceived and given birth to in their old age. The very child through whom God said he would make of Abraham a great nation. God had promised him all that Isaac was the one through whom he would make a great nation. Excuse me. And now he's supposed to kill him? And sacrifice him to God? How do you put that contradiction together? And I'm sure that was the question that went through Abraham's mind when God asked him to do this. I can imagine the emotions that must have waved through Abraham's heart. We can imagine some of the questions he must have had. I think it's significant that none of that's recorded for us here. We have no idea. It's not recorded what Abraham thought or what his emotions were. We don't know the struggle in Abraham's heart because the passage says nothing about it. All we can see from that passage is that Abraham didn't hesitate to obey. Early the next morning, they packed up. Took 2 servants with them, saddled a donkey, packed some firewood, some fire. Didn't have any matches, so they would have taken some coals in a clay jar. That was the fire. He took his son Isaac. And how old Isaac was here, we're never told. It's translated, in my translation it says a lad. I noticed what Corey read, his translation says a boy. The Hebrew word is a bit ambiguous. It can mean a boy or a lad. Sometimes servants, though, are called by that same Hebrew word. A servant, like someone who's kind of down the scheme of things on the hierarchy. They're sometimes called that same word. So whether we can say from that word how old he was, we don't know. So we really don't know. All we know that you can see later on that Isaac was the one that packed the firewood up the mountain, or up the hill. So a lot of Bible scholars feel he must have been like late teens, approaching manhood at any rate. So they head off to Moriah, which was a hilly country in which later Jerusalem would be situated in. When they got there, God was going to show Abraham which peak or which hilltop in that hilly range, which specific hilltop he wanted Isaac sacrificed on. I'm not sure at this point Abraham understood all that was going to happen. On the one hand, he had the promise from God that through Isaac his descendants would be named. Through Isaac he would be the father of a great nation. On the other hand, he had the command from the same God to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice to God. And apparently he didn't worry himself about this contradiction, or seeming contradiction. He just responded in faith. He went in obedience. We're going to look at that in a bit. So after 3 days of walking, they get within eyesight of the hill. Now, considering the distance, they must have been taking their time. I Googled it. How far from Beersheba to Jerusalem? Well, if you take Route 6, it's 106.6 kilometers. If you take Route 38, it's 101.2 kilometers. So I don't know if Abraham took Route 6 or Route 38. But as the crow flies, it's 73 kilometers. So even walking 73 kilometers, it shouldn't take 3 days, but that's why I say they must have kind of taken their time. But on the third day, they came into eyesight of the hill that God was directing Abraham to. So Abraham told the 2 servant men to wait there. He and his son would go yonder, and they would worship the Lord, and then they would return. See his faith? Abraham fully intended to offer Isaac on that altar. He also had fully intended to return with Isaac. We're going to look more into that in a bit. So Abraham took Isaac, loaded on his back the firewood, took the fire and the knife, and headed up yonder hill. And it didn't take long until Isaac asked, Father, we got the wood, we got the fire, got the knife. Where's the lamb? And as Corey said, what kind of conversation was that going to be? And again, Abraham, his response, didn't say a lot, but it was full of faith. God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering. I just thought of this. After church, ask Corey about his ride with Superintendent Tim Syme out to the bear bait. Funny story. But anyway, ask him about that later. But Abraham fully believed that God would work it out. And so the walk continued till they reached the top of the designated peak. There Abraham built an altar, likely of stones and rocks and stuff that were there. Built that altar, arranged the firewood on top of the altar. And then he tied Isaac up and laid him on top of the firewood. I've often wondered, what went through Isaac's mind when this took place? His father tying him up and putting him on the altar. He knew now who the lamb was. It must have been a pretty scary situation for Isaac. There's no talk of Isaac resisting. That seems strange to me. Did he resist? Did he fight his dad? If he was in his late teens and Abraham, he's over 100 years old, so I'm sure Isaac could have taken Abraham. But there's no talk of that. That's interesting to me. What was that conversation Abraham and Isaac had that Isaac submitted to this? Anyway, this passage doesn't tell us. It just says, then Abraham reached for his knife to kill his son. And as he grasped hold of his knife, a voice called from heaven and stopped him. And then God said, verse 11 and 12. As soon as I can find it, verse 11 and 12. The angel of the Lord came to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad. Do nothing to him. For now I know you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Well, talk about relief in the heart of Abraham. And talk about twice as much relief in the heart of Isaac. So Abraham straightened out and looked around, and there, caught in a thicket by its horns, was a ram. And he quickly got it, killed it, put it up on the altar in place of his son Isaac, who was spared, and offered the ram as a burnt offering to the Lord God. And Abraham called the place, in the Hebrew it's, well, I don't know how to pronounce it in Hebrew, but it transliterates Jehovah-Jireh. That's what Abraham named this place, Jehovah-Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. Abraham learned something more about God here. God is a God who provides. Remember what we've been seeing as we've gone through Genesis? More and more, God is revealing more and more to himself as time goes on to Abraham about who he is, about what kind of a God he is, what some of his attributes are as Abraham learns different names for God. And here he learned one more. Jehovah-Jireh. God is a God who provides. He learned that here. And so that's what he named that mountain there. In the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. And then God spoke to Abraham again and made known to him that the whole thing was a test. Now, God knew that Abraham was going to do it. Or let me back up here. The whole thing was a test. And God now knew that Abraham was prepared to obey him at any cost. And God promised once again that he would greatly bless Abraham, and repeated the covenant to him that he had made earlier. Greatly multiply his descendants. They would be like sand on the seashore, like stars in the sky. And his descendants would possess the gates of their enemies. And that in his descendants all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So on that note, Abraham and Isaac returned to the servants, and they went back home to Beersheba, where they lived. So that's the story of these verses. There's a last 5 or 6 verses there talk about Abraham's brother Nahor and his children. That's kind of added in for our benefit. And a lot of names there that are hard to pronounce. Just their descendants. Important to note there, though, is verse 23, Bethuel and Rebekah. We're going to run into those two again as we go on, because Isaac's wife would one day be Rebekah. So that's kind of the purpose of those verses there, just to give that historical context. But there are some good lessons here about testing in the Christian life. Let's look at them. As Christians, there will become times in our lives where God will test us, so we need to understand the tests of God. We can better understand the tests of God by looking at the truths about God's tests as revealed to us in this chapter. Number one, God's tests reveal the object of our true devotion. God's tests reveal the object of our true devotion. As we see from our story here, God's test for Abraham was his command to sacrifice his son, his only son Isaac, whom he loved, offer him to the Lord God. And it's significant. Look, as verse 2 says, that it emphasizes that fact that Abraham loved Isaac? Well, I just guess he did. Isaac was a child promised to him when he first came to the land of Canaan. Isaac was a child that he and his wife had waited for 25 years. He was the one they waited for while the year by year they got older and older till they were definitely beyond childbearing age. He was the miracle baby that God had blessed them with in their old age. He was the one that God promised through whom he would make Abraham a great nation. Isaac was loved by his father Abraham. Abraham loved Isaac. Now, Abraham did have another son. Ishmael, excuse me. Ishmael was, you remember the story, went through it, he was the work of the flesh. And by that I mean, he was the product of Abraham and Sarah figuring they need to help God out here in this child thing. So if Abraham could have a child through Sarah's servant girl, Hagar, they could adopt that baby, and then that baby could be the one that would be the promised son that God had promised. So it was Abraham and Sarah taking things into their own hands and trying to do things on their own. Work of the flesh, that's what I mean by that. That was Ishmael. But by the direction of God, Ishmael, after Isaac was born, along with his mother, were sent away. Now, Abraham had loved Ishmael, probably still did, but that was years before. He hadn't seen him for years. He was compelled to send him away. So Isaac only had one child left to love, and that was Isaac. So yes, Abraham did love Isaac. And now God's request was that Abraham offer Isaac as a burnt offering to him. See what that test was? The test of devotion. To whom was Abraham more devoted? To his son Isaac or to his God? And the test was going to reveal that. And did it ever? Abraham loved his son Isaac as much as is possible for a father to love a son. But the test revealed he loved God more. And friends, God's test will do that. God's test will reveal where our true devotion lies, whether it's with him or with someone else or with something else. And God's test will come in such a way that we must respond in some way, and our response will show where our devotion lies. Not that God doesn't know. Of course he knows where our affections lie, but often we don't know. We say our total devotion is with God, but is it really? Sometimes we need a test to reveal to us just where our devotion lies. We're asked to get rid of something that's dear to us. Or God takes something from us that's dear to us. And our response will demonstrate where our devotion lies. So friend, remember this as you face the tests that God gives you. It's designed to reveal where your devotion lies. Sometimes our devotion gradually slips from God to other things or to other people. So gradually that we don't even realize it. And the test will shake us up to see where that is. And Abraham passed this test with flying colors. If a test like this would come your way, would you pass like Abraham did? Where is your devotion? Secondly, God's tests are designed to stretch our faith. God's tests are designed to stretch our faith. There's a fundamental problem attached to this test that came to Abraham. We already briefly touched on it. Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his only son Isaac. But God had already promised before this that this was the son through whom he would make Abraham a great nation. In other words, God promised that Isaac would have children. That's what that promise means. It has to. Abraham had no other son, and he would have no other, as far as the son of the promise that God would give him is concerned. The problem is, how do those two go together? On the one hand, God's promise concerning Isaac. On the other hand, God's command to put Isaac to death. So how could those two work together? They're contradictory. I tell you, this is something that stretched Abraham's faith. Here he had from the same God both a promise and a command, and the two are in total contradiction. Seemingly. What should he do? Well, we see what he did. He obeyed God's command. He fully intended to carry it out. And at the same time, never for a minute doubted that God would keep his promise concerning Isaac and his children. He would obey God's command, and as far as God keeping his promise, well, that's God's problem. He would do what God commanded him to do. Abraham had enough faith to believe that God was big enough to do that. You see, he had to believe that God could work out the contradiction. And I'm sure it stretched his faith, as it would anybody's, but his faith rose to the occasion. Now, the book of Hebrews gives us a hint as to what Abraham was expecting, what was going through his mind. So flip over to Hebrews chapter 11. I want you to see this. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 through 19. Hebrews 11, 17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendant shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So we see that Abraham believed God would raise Isaac from the dead. That's what Abraham was thinking as he was doing this. Which was indeed a great faith, because at this time God hadn't revealed hardly anything about resurrection from the dead. But that's what Abraham believed, and so he acted in obedience. He was going to go through with it, fully trust that God would raise Isaac from the dead. And obedience, which is faith in action, his faith was stretched, but his faith made his obedience possible. Friends, God's tests are designed for just this purpose, to stretch our faith. That is part of the process of growing in Christ. In that process, our faith must grow. And it never will unless it is stretched. And to accomplish that, God sends a test to stretch our faith. Often this test will involve things that we just don't understand. It may involve a seeming contradiction. And in order to pass the test, we need to stretch our faith enough to believe that God is big enough to work out the contradiction. We had an experience like this in our family. It's now 28 years ago. Something that none of us will ever forget. Some of you, I've told this story before, some of you have heard it before. My older sister, Mary, and some of you have gotten to know her after she's moved to Lloydminster now. But my older sister, Mary, 28 years ago, and her husband realized that they were expecting a child. And that was a great surprise, because she had 3 years previous to that had undergone surgery to have her tubes tied. They had 3 girls. They wanted a boy, especially her husband Cliff. They all wanted a boy. They wanted a son, but it wasn't happening, and so they decided that they're getting on a bit, and it just wasn't going to happen. So after the 3 girls and a period of time and nothing more was happening, Mary underwent surgery to have her tubes tied. And now she's pregnant. Total surprise. At first they had trouble accepting the pregnancy. They had come to the place where they don't want another child. They didn't want another one. But as the months went by, they saw the hand of God in this, and came to be quite excited about this baby. They were really looking forward to it. As time went on, they got used to the idea and saw the hand of God in it, and got really excited about this new baby coming. The due date was August 9th, and I remember that because that was the same year that we were expecting Amanda. Amanda was due the end of October. This baby was due August the 9th. Mary scheduled surgery for shortly after the baby was born to have the doctor do a decent job of her tubes, having them cut and cauterized instead of just tied. So all was set. On August the 6th, Mary said the baby was very, very active inside her. But then it was over. She felt nothing after that. By Thursday, had an ultrasound, and the ultrasound revealed that the baby was dead. They induced her, and the baby was born on August the 10th. A little boy. And to top it all off, when the doctor did the surgery, later on, he said that there was nothing wrong with those knots in her tubes. Couldn't see how she could have gotten pregnant. Now, you talk about a story of contradictions. That certainly was one for our family. I still remember it like it was yesterday. The struggle that was. Why did God perform a miracle to allow the pregnancy to happen and then take the baby just 4 or 5 days before it was born? And why was it a boy? They had wanted a boy for at least their past 2 pregnancies. And now when they have one, God takes its life. Why? All kinds of seeming contradictions. Friends, God's tests are like that. They involve things that we don't understand. They involve things that seem contradictory. It is designed this way to stretch our faith. If we could see the answer, it wouldn't stretch our faith much, would it? But we can't see the answer. And so our faith must be stretched to the point where we trust God to work out the contradictions that for the life of us we can't understand. And we simply respond in obedience. And again, Abraham passed this test with flying colors. When God sends the test to you and I, will our faith be stretched to the point of trusting God to work out the contradictions? Will we pass the test? Thirdly and finally, God's tests always include His provision. God's tests always include His provision. As this story concludes, we see that God provided Abraham with what he needed to make a sacrifice to God. A ram was provided to offer on the altar in Isaac's place. God revealed to Abraham that Isaac's sacrifice was just a test. He didn't have to go through with it. He passed the test with flying colors, and then God provided the ram. And friends, that is a very important aspect of God's tests. When He sends a test our way, God always provides whatever we need to complete the test. Remember that. God provides. That's why His name is Jehovah Jireh, God who provides. Remember that. God's provision is part of the test package. Whether you need material provision or emotional provision or spiritual provision, it's provided along with the test. And Abraham was very struck with God's provision on this occasion. He even called the place, like I said, Jehovah Jireh, which translated the Lord will provide. What a tremendous truth this is. Abraham learned something about God here. God is a God who provides. So let's remember this important truth, friend. When God sends you a test, remember this. God provides. He always has. He always will. He will, with the test, give you what you need to go through the test as you respond to Him in faith. He will take care of your physical and material needs. He will supply the spiritual strength you need to stretch your faith. This whole story is also a profound picture of the greatest provision God has ever made for you and I. And God definitely meant it to be that. And that provision is, of course, our salvation. The wages of sin is death. We all deserve to die in hell for all eternity. Because that's what our sin deserves. That's the paycheck. That's what we've earned. The sacrifice of Isaac is a picture of the death we deserve. But what happened? God provided a substitute. He stopped Abraham from killing Isaac and instead provided a substitute, a ram, to die in Isaac's place. What a great picture of God providing a substitute for us, Jesus, to die in our place. God is a God who provides our greatest need, that being our salvation from the penalty of our sin. There's even more going on here that I'm not going to take the time to unpack today. But, teaser for next week. We're going to look at the same passage again next week. Next week we'll do communion. Next Sunday. Next Sunday we'll have a communion service and we'll look at the same passage again and looking at this rich way in which this story foreshadows Jesus and what he did on the cross. That's your teaser for next week. It's so profound. So we'll close with this profound truth. God is a God who provides. Abraham found this out. And so will you, friend, as you face the test God sends and responds in true devotion and faith. Therefore, we see from this passage some truths about the tests of God. God's tests reveal the object of our true devotion. God's tests are designed to stretch our faith. And God's truth always includes his provision. I don't know where you all are at. Maybe that some of you are going through some testing right now. I don't know. But I hope if you are, you can take some comfort and some assurance from this passage. This is a great opportunity as you face the test for your faith to stretch and grow. And God will provide. God will provide. Though you won't know how until crunch time. If you are not facing any particular test right now, you will. You will. And I will. What will the test reveal about our true heart's devotion? Will the test stretch our faith? As we respond in faith, the promise is we will see in a marvelous way God's provision for us. Treasure these testing times, friend. In order to grow, you need them. As you respond appropriately, may they become, and they may well become, your most cherished memories. Let's take our time of silence. Just open your heart to what God may be saying to you personally this morning.